I'm Luena from Brazil, the Humpback Whale Institute. We are based in Bahia, which is in the northeast of Brazil. And so we saw two examples of, in fact, Miranda showed quite a few examples of research that can be carried out when we're watching boats, and also the importance of those, okay? And I'm a biologist, and I just recently finished my master in ecology, and I used data collected from a whale watching platform for my master thesis, okay? And so this is what I'm bringing for you today. Yeah, that'd be really nice. Yeah, I think you would. So this is the title of my talk, an integrated framework to assess the carrying capacity of whale watching tourism, okay? So I have to give you a little bit background of why I studied this and what does it mean, okay? And I really like this sentence from a very famous whale researcher, most of you must know him, which is Roger Payne, and he talks about the power that whales have to really make people love the ocean, okay? So he says, for I believe that's the principal gift that whales offer humanity, is that they are the only animals that can impress us enough to persuade us to change our minds about the importance of the wild world. So this is why we do what we do, okay? And but there's another question to that, which is, I don't know if you heard of this, the tragedy of the commons. It's also a very famous paper by Harding from 1968, where he says, therein is a tragedy, each man locked into a system that compels him to increase his herd without limit, in a world that is limited. And ruin is the destination toward which all men rush, each pursuing his own best interest in a society that believes in the freedom of the commons. Freedom in the commons brings ruin to all. This brings us back a little bit to Professor Ken's talk from yesterday, how we are impelled to grow without limits, but our world is limited, and so are our whales. Okay, so in the context of whale watching, okay, we are all promoting whale watching as a non-consumptive activity, an activity that does not consume the whales. However, the fact that whale watching can affect the behavior of whales has been known for a long time, okay, for over 25 years. And even though most of the evidence exists for toothed whales, dolphins, odontocetes, and not so much for baleen whales, okay, the fact is known, all right? So we can consider whales then as a common pool resource. And this brings us back a little bit to economic concepts, which I don't like economy at all, but it's part of this research. Okay, I'm holding it. I'll just come move. Okay, so why can they be considered a common pool resource? Because there are effects impacting the populations. Okay, so when the viability of these populations become affected by tourism, okay, they become a common pool resource. And what does that mean? Well, a common pool resource is subtractable, okay, so one's usage reduces the amount available to others. So in terms of whale watching, if you spend too much time with one group, okay, that group may leave an area, for example, and they won't be available to other whale watchers. That's just one example, okay? And it's also non-excludable. It's accessible to everyone. So obviously, whales migrate. They don't stay in one population. So there's also no ownership of whales, of this resource, okay? So without management, resources can become depleted from overuse, okay? So this is the background to my research. How can we limit this usage, all right? But there is hope, okay, because the adequate management and use of these resources can prevent the tragedy, okay? But that brings us back to what was mentioned in Ken Finley's talk as well, which is a shift in paradigm. So we have to stop thinking about whale watching as just plain beneficial, but as a form of non-lethal exploitation, okay? And that can have impacts on the animals, right? So we need a paradigm shift. We need to accept that whale watching can impact these animals and that it needs to be regulated for sustainability. Okay, I think we all know that by now and we all agree with that. Okay, but sustainable management is not that simple. Okay, to be generally sustainable, whale watching must be ecologically, socially, and economically sustainable, which requires an integrated and multidisciplinary approach. Okay, so we need to find sustainable limits, and they need to be based on carrying capacity. Okay. And based also on the precautionary principle. So let's not wait for the tragedy to start until we do something, okay? And although there's a lot of studies talking about whale watching management, there isn't much information on how to calculate the carrying capacity for a specific locality. So my study was about that, and I went out looking, and it was quite difficult to find a straightforward answer. So I tried to bring that in my study. Okay. So throughout the world, there's a variety of regulations, voluntary and legislative. Okay, they have been developed in an attempt to manage whale watching in a sustainable way. Okay, and there is a general view that regulations instead of voluntary codes and permit conditions provide the greatest level of management. Okay, and certainty and control for the sustainable management of whale watching. So in many places around the world, there is already a permit system. Okay, like I can give examples of New Zealand, Australia, obviously South Africa, Argentina, Chile, the Azores as well. Okay, and this permit system, it has to be based on something. Okay, how many permits are we gonna issue? What are we gonna base this decision on? Now, the Brazilian legislation, we have specific whale watching legislation since 1996, and it does not require a special permit for whale watching. Okay. The only instance where the number of boats operating should be limited is when it happens inside a protected area where there are regularly cetaceans occurring. Okay, but otherwise, if it's not in a protected area, there's no limits to how many boats can operate. Okay. Now, in Brazil, we have two main protected areas that are protecting humpback whale habitats. Okay. The Brolhos National Marine Park, okay, and this is an established marine park. It has a management plan, a public use plan, and all boats that operate there are registered, and the number of boats is limited as well. In 2003, the North Coast Continental Shelf Protected Area was created, okay, but still 13 years after, there's no management plan, there is no management council, so it's really only on paper. Okay, so there's an urgent need for implementation of this protected area, and also more studies in the area, because most of the studies on whale watching impacts in Brazil have been carried out in the Brolhos National Marine Park, and not so many north up the coast in North Bahia. Okay. Now, what is tourism carrying capacity? It's a bit of a complex one. Okay. Normally, it's assumed there is a positive relationship between number of tourists and the amount of impacts. Okay, but it's not that simple. It's a complex process and it involves many factors, a combination of factors. In relation to whale watching, when you think about carrying capacity, it could relate to the maximum number of platforms, or how many boats can you have in an area. But it could also mean how many tourists per boat, or how many trips per day, and other relevant factors for a particular area. Okay? So what we need to establish is levels of tolerance of the animals to the activity, to whale watching. Okay? There has been several methodologies developed around the world to assess tourism carrying capacity. Okay? But the examples are limits of acceptable changes, tourism carrying capacity, okay? But one common point is that you need to look at several factors and several stakeholders, obviously. So in the case of whale watching, we have the whales, which relates to biological impacts, okay? The tourists, so we have to take into account the social impacts, and also the operators, which translate into economic impacts, okay? The problem is, for example, with the biological impacts, it's not so easy to demonstrate, okay? Especially for baleen whales, there are lots of cases that although we can see that, and we know that there are impacts, they are hard to demonstrate, okay? Or usually we don't see an impact in that occasion, but the impacts can occur much later in other areas in the case of migratory animals. All right? And then we have an author called Cifuentes, that did work for the WWF, okay? And this concept incorporates the management capacity. So apart from those three that I already mentioned, you also have to take into account what management capacity you have in an area. So it's all good, it's all going well, the whales are doing well, the boats are doing well, the tourists are satisfied, but you have no management, so let's issue lots of permits. But who's going to enforce, who's going to monitor, is there structure for monitoring? Okay, so you have to think about that as well. So really, whale watching carrying capacity must take into account the whales, the tourists, the operators, and also the planning and the management agencies, okay? So I came up with taking into account all those factors. I tried to come up with a framework, okay? So it's a bit frustrating because what I hoped to get at the end of my master was a magic number or a mathematical formula or algorithm that I could go to people and say, okay, you want to establish permits? Hey, this is how you calculate how many boats you can have in an area. It doesn't work quite like that. So I came up with a framework, okay, taking into account those four aspects, and we have to take into consideration the relationships between them, okay? So this is really important because each one of those boxes influences the other one, okay? So just to give an example, all right, if we take into account, for example, social carrying capacity, which relates, for example, tourist satisfaction, are your tourists satisfied? Tourist perceptions, did the tourists feel crowded? Did they think there were too many boats watching a group or too many tourists in the boat? Did they think that the whales were getting disturbed or not? So this is the kind of things that you have to look into, and what education is happening. Is it being affected? Okay, and this is going to be influenced, for example, by the biological carrying capacity, okay? So if you have lots of whales in an area, obviously the tourists are more inclined to think that everything is okay and they'll be happier because they saw lots of whales. But then if you have less whales, the tourists might think that there's a problem or the trip wasn't so nice, okay? The same thing with the economic carrying capacity, okay? So it's okay, let's issue lots of permits, but then you don't have enough demand. So I was talking to Peter yesterday about that, okay? So if you have 10 boats, but most of them, all these 10 boats are going out with only 40% capacity every day, then you really don't need any more boats, okay? So this is something that you have to look into as well. The biological carrying capacity is going to influence the social carrying capacity, as I just said already, but it's also going to influence the management carrying capacity. So if you have changes in your population, then you have to adapt your management strategies. So maybe reduce the number of permits, reduce the time of boats can spend with the whales, okay? On the other hand, the management carrying capacity, so the legislation, the licensing, the monitoring you have will influence the population, will safeguard, protect, and may promote the recovery of the populations as well. And so on. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, okay? We can talk, if you want to talk to me about that later. I would be really interested in finding out your opinions, okay? But I took as an example, as a study case, what's going on in Praia do Forte in northern Bahia, okay? So how this framework can be applied to assessing the carrying capacity for a specific area, okay? So just very quickly, what happened in Brazil from whaling to whale watching is that obviously, like we all heard already, the 20th century was a time of intense commercial whaling along the Brazilian coast, but also the Southern Ocean. So the Brazilian population, our humpbacks, were reduced to less than 4% of their estimated original size, okay? But then in 1987, all whaling was prohibited in Brazil, and scientists working in the Abrolhos National Marine Park discovered this remnant population of humpback whales. And then during the 90s, the whale watching tourism started as an opportunistic activity in the Abrolhos National Marine Park. Okay. In 1990, we had the first whale watching regulations come out. They were revised in 1996, and in 2000, the whale watching started on the north coast in Praia do Forte. And in 2002, we had another revision of the whale watching regulations. Okay, so this is 16 years ago already. So we are working on a new revision of the regulations. Okay. So this is the migratory route of this population, this particular population, which is stock A. Okay, so they spend the summertime in the Georgia, South Sandwich Islands, and then they migrate up to northeast Brazil. Most of the whales stay around do we have a pointer here? Because I can't move. So they stay, about 80% of the whales that come to Brazil, they stay around the Abrolhos National Marine Park. Okay, which is that extension of the continental shelf you can see at the top there, and then all the others spread around along the coast. Okay, so this is Abrolhos Bank here. Okay, so it's the main breeding ground in the southwestern Atlantic Ocean. Okay, there's an archipelago, but it's also a very important coral reef system. And then we have Praia do Forte. And what's happening is with the recovery of the population, they are reoccupying these former breeding grounds. And Praia do Forte is great for whale watching because it's a very narrow continental shelf, so the whales come very close to shore. Okay, this is a map. So we've been working directly in partnership with the whale watching operators since 2001 in Praia do Forte. We come on board about 70% of the trips. There's our interns, our research staff is on board collecting data, so we have a long time data set. Okay, so since 2001 we have been collecting data, and we established here. Okay, so this is Bahia. This is where we are here. Okay, this is Praia do Forte, and enlarged here, the shaded polygon. It's actually the area that the whale watching boats operate in. Okay, so from all the GPS tracks, we draw this area here. The rectangle is the North Coast Continental Shelf Protected Area. It's a long name, okay? But as you can see, the operation is exactly inside the protected area, so there should be a permit system and the number of boats should be limited. But like I said before, this is not happening yet, okay? But that was the point of my study, okay? So hopefully in the future we will implement this permit system there. So operators there use a variety of boats, from wooden schooners that take 40 people to catamarans and small speedboats, all right? So obviously each one of these has different impacts and characteristics, okay? So through this partnership with the operators, we are able to come on board the trips. We collect scientific data like number of whales, behavior, geographical position, group composition, all that, okay? But we also hand out questionnaires to the tourists on the way back, and we've been doing this since 2003, okay? And on average, 50% of the tourists say they're totally satisfied with the trip. So we have from 1 to 5, 1 being dissatisfied and 5 totally satisfied, okay? 96% of the tourists that go whale watching Praia do Forte say they would go whale watching there again, okay? 76% rate the boat conduct excellent. Obviously, you have to take this, with a pinch of salt, okay? They're not experts, but before they go on the whale watching trips, they get an informative talk by the Humpback Whale Institute. So we tell them what the legislation is, what is the adequate conduct for the boats, okay? And they have been rating the boat conduct excellent. 69% rate the information provided by the onboard guides excellent too, okay? So we're doing okay there. Now the operators. I did a questionnaire in 2015 for my master's, where I asked several questions to the operators, and then I found out there's 39 permanent jobs if you take all the operators together. 14 are seasonal, so on top of those 39, they also employ another 14 people during the whale season, and 26 of those are from the local community. Okay, the operators say the activity is profitable and viable, economically viable, and that they expect future growth. Okay, but they also said that the growth is limited by demand. So at the moment there isn't demand for more boats operating in the area. Okay, and then I also, from what we know, from our experience in working in the area and from what the operators answered, we know that there is very little management from the management agencies. So really what happens is that an NGO, the Humpback Whale Institute, is carrying out this role of monitoring and managing this activity in partnership with the operators. Okay, so this collaboration between NGO and operators is the currently only form of management that we have in the area. Okay, so we provide the training every year for their staff. We also give the information to the tourists before the trips. We come on board to monitor and collect scientific research. Okay, and the operators, they make a financial contribution to the Humpback Whale Institute. So this is their way of contributing to research also through this partnership. Okay. What about the whales? So, how are the whales doing in the area? Okay, so in Praia do Forte, whale watching is carried out on a reproductive ground, obviously. Okay, so the whales are involved in reproductive activities like courtship, mating, and nursing. So by nature, it's a delicate area. Okay, we also know there's greater pressure on females with calves because these groups come closer to shore, they're easier to observe, and everybody obviously loves watching the calves. Okay, so probably the most significant biological impact is the interruption of reproductive behavior. Okay, on the other hand, as we saw in the map, the operation is on a very limited area, and the whales, therefore, they can avoid the disturbance by moving away from the boats to a different area, or by compensating. So the amount of time that maybe a female stops nursing because there's a boat around can be compensated later on because there's a very small number of boats and they don't get observed for a very long time during a 24-hour cycle. Okay. However, we also know from our studies that there's greater pressure on females and calves towards the end of the season because they stay the latest in the area. The young males and females, they leave first. So towards September and October, most of the groups observed are females with calves. And we know that this period in calf growth is very important because they are born, they drink a little bit of milk, well, 100 liters a day, but towards the end of the season, they're drinking like 400 liters a day, and their mothers have been starving or fasting for so many months, and they have to produce so much more milk, so this pressure towards the end of the season could be significant, and we probably wouldn't notice the effects of these until much later on, because we don't know if these cows will be able to complete their migration back to the feeding grounds or not. Okay, so we have to take this into account. On the other hand, the number of whales and calves has been increasing constantly over the years. The population is recovering, so there's no obvious impact from whale watching to this population. Okay. Another important point as well is that the whales that frequent the area, they have very low fidelity and occupancy rates. Okay, so they don't stay a long time there. Okay, so for example, in the Abrolhos Bank, they tend to stay for 15 days around there, and in Praia do Forte only 5 days. Okay, so that's a very little time. So that's the amount of whale watching pressure they're going to receive. Okay, during the season. Also. Contrary to Abrolhos, where there's an archipelago and most of the females and calves are seen around the archipelago for protection, there's no archipelago in Praia do Forte. It's a very narrow continental shelf, so the females and calves are moving over extensive areas. So again, the disturbance pressure is quite low. We have studies that show that these whales can travel up to 600 kilometers during the season. Okay, so they're moving around a lot. They don't hang around for too much. But then we have the acoustic disturbance. We also have studies, acoustic studies in the area. We analyze the noise from the vessels and the behavior of the animals when the vessel approach. There is an evident change of behavior. Okay, it could be just startle. For example, the boat approaches and the whales are there singing, but they stop singing when the boat approaches, or they are engaged in one type of behavior, and then when the boat leaves and the noise is up, they stop doing what they're doing. Okay, so we've already registered that. But again, the population has been growing for the past years, on average 10% a year. Okay, so really, we cannot say that this is having a strong impact. So my conclusions, taking that framework I came up with and trying to look at Praia do Forte as a case study, is that the whale watching activity there is a very low impact activity at the moment. It's economically viable, it generates jobs and income, it's educational for the tourists and for the community. There's high satisfaction, okay, from the tourists. On the other hand, we know that the whales in our coast are subject to multiple threats. So not just whale watching, but we know that there's problems with a variety of human activities like boat traffic, coastal developments, seismic exploration, entanglements, acoustic disturbances, climatic changes, so you have to look at these cumulative impacts. And on the other hand, we also have insufficient information, I found, okay, with the social carrying capacity, we need more studies on that. We need more studies on behavioral changes, because we collect data from on board the vessels. But really, if you want to study changes in behavior relating to vessel approach, you need land station studies. We do those in Abrolhos, but we don't do in Praia do Forte because we don't have a high point to do it from. So I need to build a tower for myself so I can watch there. Okay, so we need more studies. So taking that into consideration, my suggestion is keeping the whale watching at its current level, not increasing until we have more management capacity and more information as well. Okay, but I was able to make some recommendations. Okay, obviously keeping up the long-term monitoring and improving it with other types of studies. So land station studies, like I said, very important to study behavioral changes. We need to study cumulative exposure, encounter rate, how many times the same whale is observed by how many boats during the day. We don't have that data yet. More bioacoustics, more social studies with the tourists, okay, and also cumulative impacts. So looking at other threats in the area, so it could be recreational boats, it could be fishing boats, it could be other things, okay? And my next step will be coming up with indicators for that framework, okay? So this is also very specific to species, population, and areas. So in the case of humpback whales in Praia do Forte, an indicator for biological carrying capacity could be if the number of calves falls below 60%, then it's a red alert. You should reduce the number of boats, okay? For the economic carrying capacity, like I said before, if the boats are all going out with 85% tourist capacity, then maybe it's the time to issue more permits or allow more boats to operate. So we need, these indicators have to be site-specific, and it's my next challenge, okay? Also, like I said before, we're looking into revising the legislation, implementing things like a 15-minute limit for females with calves, at the moment it's 30 minutes, a 300-meter buffer zone, so we can approach to 100 meters, but probably from 300 meters we should be slowing down speed and other recommendations. Having a naturalist guide on board should be in the legislation. It's not, so it's optional for our operators. Okay. Also, specific training for the naturalist guides, and obviously a permit system. Okay. And finally, implementing, like I said, the management plan for the North Coast continental shelf. It's so difficult. This has existed for 15 years now, and nothing came out of paper yet. This obviously should be built with participation based on the current legislation, and limiting areas where the boats can operate, and also reserving areas where there will be no boat operation, so those whales can get a rest. Okay, so A whale watching association could be also beneficial to improve the self-regulation and self-management, since we have not so much involvement from the management agencies. Okay, and obviously a certification scheme like Whale Heritage Sites would very much also improve the conditions in the area. Okay, so again, my special thanks to Cetacean Society International for allowing me to be here today. Thank you. I talked a lot. Okay. Any questions?
In your framework, was there scope? I didn't see it clearly in there. Was there scope for almost different rules or regulations for migratory populations to calving and breeding populations?
Yeah. So that's the management carrying capacity must take that all into account. So like I said, the framework is a baseline, but then you have to look into the context. So it will, different aspects will have to be taken into account according to where it's being applied to. Okay, so in Praia do Forte, the critical aspect may be the amount of time that females and calves are watched for. So in the management carrying capacity, you will have to look into legislation that limits that. In other places, you will have to take into account other aspects. So for example, if I have a resident population that feeds in a bay, then you need to maybe limit access to that bay. Like it happens, for example, in Fernando de Noronha with the spinner dolphins. They spend time resting in a bay, so boats are not allowed into that bay. I don't know if that answers you.
Well, it does, but what I see is that a country has a permit that's specific to the country, and within the country there's bays and there's migratory species, and there's just one permit, one size fits all.
Yeah.
So feeling like.
But that can be incorporated in the management plan for the protected areas, for example. So Praia do Forte is inside a protected area. So in its management plan, you could have specific guidelines for that. You know, it's an official document. It's legislation. Okay, and then outside the protected areas, unfortunately, our legislation does not require the limitation of number of boats or anything, so we need to change the legislation again, you know. So sometimes it's really changing the rules, and the scientific data that we collect is the basis for all that. So all the research we do is subsidizing the changes in the regulations that we are trying to achieve. This is why it's so important to collect data, to have long-term data, and to have research on board the whale watching vessels, but also research on whale watching impacts on the populations.
Do you have any private boats? Because framework.
Yeah, recreational boats. You mean?
Yeah, recreational boats. Yeah.
Yeah, there are, and those are not limited, like in any way, or monitored. That's like I said, there's cumulative impact. So we are monitoring the whale watching boats, but there could be 30 other speedboats out there approaching the whales in a not so correct way.
We find that's always the difficulty.
Yeah.
The government can regulate a commercial operator, but there's no way to regulate private vessels, and that's what we always find. You can have 3 boats doing the right thing, being commercial operators, and then get swarmed by 30 boats. So,
it's much harder, yeah.
And it's never taken into account the cumulative impact. Every talker throughout this whole conference talks about the impact on whale watching, usually from the commercial aspect, but no one's taken into consideration the cumulative impact of all the private vessels.
Exactly. The legislation in Brazil applies to everyone, commercial or not. But there's a lot less attention or information given out to recreational boat users. We tend to concentrate on the commercial whale watching.
But that's right. Like you say, in an area will only allow 10 commercial operators, but assumably, even if it's a protected area, you don't limit how many private vessels go in there.
That's why when issuing permits, you have to take into account those cumulative impacts. So you can't just look at one thing. Oh, no, there's only 4 boats in this area, 4 commercial boats, but how many others are there? So maybe you have to have less commercial boats because there are already so many recreational boats.
The rules apply to the commercial boats should be exactly the same to the recreational.
And they are.
It happens in the ASOS, it's like that.
Yeah, and they are in Brazil too.
They cannot say that they don't know the rules. The rules are exactly the same.
It's not the rules, it's the cumulative impact of vessel after vessel. You say the commercial boat, you only have 15 minutes from the whale. That usually doesn't apply, you know.
I have a question.
Okay.
How do you deal with this acoustic disturbance? You mentioned in your presentation that whales, they change behavior, or you've noticed that whales change behavior when vessels approach, and how do you guys deal with it?
I can give you the reference later. Study was my master supervisor. He specialized in bioacoustic. That's Dr. Marcos Rossi Santos. So he uses hydrophones. So he did a study in the area with hydrophones, so measuring the boat noise, and at the same time the noise the whales are making, and at the same time visual observations. And then you relate all this information to see if one thing is impacting the other.
And then I have another follow-up question that links up with the presentations that were given earlier. There was a slide showing there were 9 posters done, there were peer reviewers them. How do the normal people, the normal the public,
The general public.
the normal people, how do the public, the general public, get access in an understandable way of what you guys are researching?
Great question. Yeah. So we, as an NGO, we struggle. Well, we are committed to education and to bringing the scientific information to the general public, to schools, to kids. So we have information material. I'll give you one later. So we have a little brochure, a little flyer about whale watching, and it just has basic information on the whales. It has the legislation, good conduct, the behaviors. Okay, so this is available to the general public. My research, I'm trying to show it to the more people I can, so in different forums as well. So I'm showing it back home, I'm showing it here, I'm showing it to the humpback whale scientists in the Humpback Whale World Congress, and you're totally right. So it's so important to communicate, and a lot of research that is done, it doesn't ever come out of the papers, isn't it? So yeah, I think the challenge now is transforming this framework in something. It's a working process. This was just an initial step for me in something I'm really interested in, and I want to develop more, transform it in something really simple. Like I said, I wanted a magic number, but if that's not possible, then have it as straightforward and accessible as possible to communicate to legislators, to operators, to everyone that is working with whale watching. So I'm intended, if I ever get around to doing a PhD, I don't know if I can survive that. The master was hard enough. But like I said, carrying on, looking for indicators, and just furthering this framework a little bit more. Okay. Ah, that's so nice that you have questions. I thought my presentation was boring. After Miranda's and Rachel's and Tori's, you know. But now we need to break up because we have another half an hour, and we actually need your brain power now.